The Professor by Charlotte Brontë, Chapter 13. Next morning I rose with the dawn, and having dressed myself and stood half an hour, my elbow leaning on the chest of drawers, considering what means I should adopt to restore my spirits fagged with sleeplessness to their ordinary tone, for I had no intention of getting up a scene with Monsieur Pelet, reproaching him with perfidy, sending him a challenge, or performing other gambados of the sort, I hit at last on the expedient of walking out in the cool of the morning to a neighbouring establishment of baths, and treating myself to a bracing plunge. The remedy produced the desired effect. I came back at 7 o'clock, steadied and invigorated, and was able to greet Monsieur Pelet when he entered to breakfast with an unchanged and tranquil countenance, even a cordial offering of the hand and the flattering appellation of mon fils, pronounced in that caressing tone with which Monsieur had of late days especially been accustomed to address me, did not elicit any external signs of the feeling which, though subdued, still glowed at my heart. Not that I nursed vengeance, no, but the sense of insult and treachery lived in me like a kindling, though as yet smothered coal. God knows I am not by nature vindictive. I would not hurt a man because I can no longer trust or like him. But neither my reason nor feelings are of the vacillating order. They are not of that sand-like sort where impressions if soon made are as soon effaced. Once convinced that my friend's disposition is incompatible with my own, once assured that he is indelibly stained with certain defects obnoxious to my principles, and I dissolve the connection. I did so with Edward. As to Pelet, the discovery was yet new. Should I act thus with him? It was the question I placed before my mind as I stirred my cup of coffee with a half-pistolet. We never had spoons. Pelet, meantime, being seated opposite, his pallid face looking as knowing and more haggard than usual, his blue eye turned now sternly on his boys and ushers, and now graciously on me. "Circumstances must guide me," said I, and meeting Pelet's false glance and insinuating smile, I thanked heaven that I had last night opened my window and read by the light of a full moon the true meaning of that guileful countenance. I felt half his master, because the reality of his nature was now known to me, smile and flatter as he would. I saw his soul lurk behind his smile, and heard in every one of his smooth phrases a voice interpreting their treacherous import. But Zoraide Rotier, of course, her defection had cut me to the quick. That stint must have gone too deep for any consolations of philosophy to be available in curing its smart. Not at all. The night fever over, I looked about for balm to that wound also, and found some nearer home than at Gilead. Reason was my physician. She began by proving that the prize I had missed was of little value. She admitted that, physically, Zoraide might have suited me, but affirmed that our souls were not in harmony, and that discord must have resulted from the union of her mind with mine. She then insisted on the suppression of all repining, and commanded me rather to rejoice that I had escaped a snare. Her medicament did me good. I felt its strengthening effect when I met the directress the next day. Its stringent operation on the nerves, suffering no trembling, no faltering, it enabled me to face her with firmness, to pass her with ease. She had held out her hand to me. That I did not choose to see. She had greeted me with a charming smile. It fell on my heart like light on stone. I passed on to the estrade. She followed me. Her eye, fastened on my face, demanded of every feature the meaning of my changed and careless manner. I will give her an answer, thought I, and meeting her gaze full, arresting, fixing her glance, I shot into her eyes from my own a look where there was no respect, no love, no tenderness, no gallantry, where the strict analysis could detect nothing but scorn, hardihood, irony. I made her bear it and feel it. Her steady countenance did not change, but her colour rose, and she approached me as if fascinated. She stepped onto the estrade and stood close by my side. She had nothing to say. I would not relieve her embarrassment, and negligently turned over the leaves of a book. "I hope you feel quite recovered today," at last she said in a low tone. "And I, mademoiselle, hope that you took no cold last night in consequence of your late walk in the garden." Quick enough of comprehension, she understood me directly. Her face became a little blanched, very little, but no muscle in her rather marked features moved, and calm and self-possessed, she retired from the estrade, taking her seat quietly at a little distance, and occupying herself with netting a purse. I proceeded to give my lesson. It was a composition, that is, I dictated certain general questions of which the pupils were to compose the answers from memory, access to books being forbidden. While Mesdemoiselles Eulalie, Hortense, Caroline, etc., were pondering over the string of rather abstruse grammatical interrogatories I had propounded, I was at liberty to employ the vacant half-hour in further observing the directress herself. The green silk purse was progressing fast in her hands. Her eyes were bent upon it. Her attitude, as she sat knitting within 2 yards of me, was still yet guarded. In her whole person were expressed at once, and with equal clearness, vigilance and repose, a rare union. Looking at her, I was forced, as I had often been before, to offer her good ease, her wondrous self-control, the tribute of involuntary admiration. She had felt that I had withdrawn from her my esteem. She had seen contempt and coldness in my eye, and to her, who coveted the approbation of all around her, who thirsted after universal good opinion, such discovery must have been an acute wound. I had witnessed its effect in the momentary pallor of her cheek unused to vary. Yet how quickly, by dint of self-control, had she recovered her composure. With what quiet dignity she now sat, almost at my side, sustained by her sound and vigorous sense. No trembling in her somewhat lengthened, though shrewd upper lip. No coward shame on her austere forehead. "There is metal there," I said, as I gazed. "Would that there were fire also, living ardour to make the steel glow. Then I could love her." Presently I discovered that she knew I was watching her, for she stirred not. She lifted not her crafty eyelid. She had glanced down from her netting to her small foot, peeping from the soft folds of her purple merino gown. Thence her eye reverted to her hand, ivory white, with a bright garnet ring on the forefinger, and a light frill of lace around the wrist. With a scarcely perceptible movement, she turned her head, causing her nut-brown curls to wave gracefully. In these slight signs I read that the wish of her heart, the design of her brain, was to lure back the game she had scared. A little incident gave her the opportunity of addressing me again. While all was silence in the class, silence but for the rustling of copybooks and the travelling of pens over their pages, a leaf of the large folding door opening from the hall unclosed, admitting a pupil who, after making a hasty obeisance, ensconced herself with some appearance of trepidation, probably occasioned by her entering so late, in a vacant seat at the desk nearest the door. Being seated, she proceeded, still with an air of hurry and embarrassment, to open her cabas, to take out her books, and while I was waiting for her to look up in order to make out her identity, for, short-sighted as I was, I had not recognized her at her entrance, Mademoiselle Rotier, leaving her chair, approached the estrade. "Monsieur Crimsworth," said she in a whisper, for when the schoolrooms were silent, the directress always moved with velvet tread, and spoke in the most subdued key, enforcing order and stillness fully as much by example as precept. "Monsieur Crimsworth, that young person who has just entered, wishes to have the advantage of taking lessons with you in English. She is not a pupil of the house. She is, indeed, in one sense, a teacher, for she gives instruction in lace-mending and in little varieties of ornamental needlework. She very properly proposes to qualify herself for a higher department of education, and has asked permission to attend your lessons in order to perfect her knowledge of English, in which language she has, I believe, already made some progress. Of course, it is my wish to aid her in an effort so praiseworthy. You will permit her, then, to benefit by your instruction, n'est-ce pas, monsieur?" And Mademoiselle Rotier's eyes were raised to mine with a look at once naive, benign, and beseeching. I replied, "Of course," very laconically, almost abruptly. "Another word," she said with softness. "Mademoiselle Henri has not received a regular education. Perhaps her natural talents are not of the highest order, but I can assure you of the excellence of her intentions, and even of the amiability of her disposition. Monsieur will then, I am sure, have the goodness to be considerate with her at first, and not expose her backwardness, her inevitable deficiencies, before the young ladies who, in a sense, are her pupils. Will Monsieur Crimsworth favour me by attending to this hint?" I nodded. She continued with subdued earnestness. "Pardon me, monsieur, if I venture to add that what I have just said is of importance to the poor girl. She already experiences great difficulty in pressing these giddy young things with a due degree of deference for her authority, and should that difficulty be increased by new discoveries of her incapacity, she might find her position in my establishment too painful to be retained. A circumstance I should much regret for her sake, as she can ill afford to lose the profits of her occupation here." Mademoiselle Rotier possessed marvellous tact, but tact, the most exclusive, unsupported by sincerity, will sometimes fail of its effect. Thus on this occasion, The longer she preached about the necessity of being indulgent to the governess-pupil, the more impatient I felt as I listened. I discerned so clearly that while her professed motive was a wish to aid the dull, though well-meaning Mademoiselle Henri, her real one was no other than a design to impress me with an idea of her own exalted goodness and tender considerateness. So having again hastily nodded assent to her remarks, I obviated their renewal by suddenly demanding the compositions in a sharp accent, and stepping from the estrade, I proceeded to collect them. As I passed the governess-pupil, I said to her, "You have come in too late to receive a lesson today. Try to be more punctual next time." I was behind her and could not read in her face the effect of my not very civil speech. Probably I should not have troubled myself to do so, had I been full in front, but I observed that she immediately began to slip her books into her cabas again, and presently, after I had returned to the estrade, while I was arranging the massive compositions, I heard the folding door again open and close, and on looking up, I perceived her place vacant. I thought to myself, she will consider her first attempt at taking a lesson in English something of a failure, and I wondered whether she had departed in the sulks, or whether stupidity had induced her to take my words too literally, or, finally, whether my irritable tone had wounded her feelings. The last notion I dismissed almost as soon as I had conceived it, for, not having seen any appearance of sensitiveness in any human face since my arrival in Belgium, I had begun to regard it almost as a fabulous quality. Whether her physiognomy announced it I could not tell, for her speedy exit had allowed me no time to ascertain the circumstance. I had indeed, on 2 or 3 previous occasions, caught a passing view of her, as I believe has been mentioned before, but I had never stopped to scrutinize either her face or person, and had but the most vague idea of her general appearance. Just as I had finished rolling up the compositions, the 4 o'clock bell rang. With my accustomed alertness in obeying that signal, I grasped my hat and evacuated the premises. The end of Chapter 13. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 14. If I was punctual in quitting Mademoiselle Rothier's domicile, I was at least equally punctual in arriving there. I came the next day at 5 minutes before 2, and on reaching the schoolroom door before I opened it, I heard a rapid gabbling sound which warned me that the Prière du Midi was not yet concluded. I waited the termination thereof. It would have been impious to intrude my heretical presence during its progress. How the repeater of the prayer did cackle and splutter! I never before or since heard language enounced with such steam-engine haste. Notre Père, qui êtes aux cieux, went off like a shot. Then followed an address to Marie, Vierge Céleste, Reine des Anges, Maison d'Or, Tour de Havre, and then an invocation to the saint of the day, and then down they all sat, and the solemn rite was over. And I entered, flinging the door wide and striding in fast, as it was my wont to do now, for I had found that, in entering with aplomb and mounting the estrade with emphasis, consisted the grand secret of ensuring immediate silence. The folding doors between the 2 classes, open for the prayer, were instantly closed. A maitresse, work-box in hand, took her seat at her appropriate desk. The pupils sat still with their pens and books before them. My 3 beauties in the van, now well humbled by a demeanour of consistent coolness, sat erect with their hands folded quietly on their knees. They had given up giggling and whispering to each other, and no longer ventured to utter pert speeches in my presence. They now only talked to me occasionally with their eyes, by means of which organs they could still, however, say very audacious and coquettish things. Had affection, goodness, modesty, real talent ever employed those bright orbs as interpreters? I do not think I could have refrained from giving a kind and encouraging, perhaps an ardent reply now and then, but as it was, I found pleasure in answering the glance of vanity with the gaze of stoicism. Youthful, fair, brilliant as were many of my pupils, I can truly say that in me they never saw any other bearing than such as an austere, though just guardian, might have observed towards them. If any doubt the accuracy of this assertion, as inferring more conscientious self-denial or Scipio-like self-control than they feel disposed to give me credit for, let them take into consideration the following circumstances which, while detracting from my merit, justify my veracity. Know, O incredulous reader, that a master stands in a somewhat different relation towards a pretty, light-headed, probably ignorant girl to that occupied by a partner at a ball or a gallant on the promenade. A professor does not meet his pupil to see her dressed in satin and muslin, with hair perfumed and curled, neck scarcely shaded by aerial lace, round white arms circled with bracelets, feet dressed for the gliding dance. It is not his business to whirl her through the waltz, to feed her with compliments, to heighten her beauty by the flush of gratified vanity. Neither does he encounter her on the smooth-rolled, tree-shaded boulevard in the green and sunny park, whither she repairs clad in her becoming walking dress, her scarf thrown with grace over her shoulders, her little bonnet scarcely screening her curls, the red rose under its brim adding a new tint to the softer rose on her cheek. Her face and eyes, too, illumined with smiles, perhaps as transient as the sunshine of the gala day, but also quite as brilliant. It is not his office to walk by her side, to listen to her lively chat, to carry her parasol, scarcely larger than a green broad-leaf, to lead in a ribbon her Blenheim spaniel or Italian greyhound. No. He finds her in the schoolroom, plainly dressed, with books before her. Owing to her education or her nature, books are to her a nuisance, and she opens them with aversion. Yet her teacher must instill into her mind the contents of these books. That mind resists the admission of grave information. It recoils, it grows restive. Sullen tempers are shown, disfiguring frowns spoil the symmetry of the face, sometimes coarse gestures banish grace from the deportment, while muttered expressions, redolent of native and ineradicable vulgarity, desecrate the sweetness of the voice. Where the temperament is serene, though the intellect be sluggish, an unconquerable dullness opposes every effort to instruct. Where there is cunning but not energy, dissimulation, falsehood, 1,000 schemes and tricks are put in play to evade the necessity of application. In short, to the tutor, female youth, female charms are like tapestry hangings of which the wrong side is continually turned towards him. And even when he sees the smooth, neat external surface, he so well knows what knots, long stitches, and jagged ends are behind, that he has scarce a temptation to admire too fondly the seemly forms and bright colours exposed to general view. Our likings are regulated by our circumstances. The artist prefers a hilly country because it is picturesque. The engineer a flat one because it is convenient. The man of pleasure likes what he calls a fine woman. She suits him. The fashionable young gentleman admires the fashionable young lady. She is of his kind. The toil-worn, fagged, probably irritable tutor, blind almost to beauty, insensible to airs and graces, glories chiefly in certain mental qualities. Application, love of knowledge, natural capacity, docility, truthfulness, gratefulness are the charms that attract his notice and win his regard. These he seeks, but seldom meets. These, if by chance he finds, he would fain retain forever, and when separation deprives him of them, he feels as if some ruthless hand had snatched from him his only ewe lamb. Such being the case, and the ease it is, my readers will agree with me that there was nothing either very meritorious or very marvellous in the integrity and moderation of my conduct at Mademoiselle Ruther's Pensionnat des Demoiselles. My first business this afternoon consisted in reading the list of places for the month, determined by the relative correctness of the compositions given the preceding day. The list was headed, as usual, by the name of Sylvie, that plain, quiet little girl I have described before as being at once the best and ugliest pupil in the establishment. The second place had fallen to the lot of a certain Léonie Ledru, a diminutive, sharp-featured, and parchment-skinned creature of quick wits, frail conscience, and indurated feelings, a lawyer-like thing of whom I used to say that, had she been a boy, she would have made a model of an unprincipled, clever attorney. Then came Eulalie, the proud beauty, the Juno of the school, whose 6 long years of drilling in the simple grammar of the English language had compelled, despite the stiff phlegm of her intellect, to acquire a mechanical acquaintance with most of its rules. No smile, no trace of pleasure or satisfaction appeared in Sylvie's nun-like and passive face as she heard her name read first. I always felt saddened by the sight of that poor girl's absolute quiescence on all occasions, and it was my custom to look at her, to address her as seldom as possible. Her extreme docility, her assiduous perseverance, would have recommended her warmly to my good opinion. Her modesty, her intelligence, would have induced me to feel most kindly, most affectionately towards her, notwithstanding the almost ghastly plainness of her features, the disproportion of her form, the corpse-like lack of animation in her countenance had I not been aware that every friendly word, every kindly action, would be reported by her to her confessor, and by him misinterpreted and poisoned. Once I had laid my hand on her head in token of approbation. I thought Sylvie was going to smile, her dim eye almost kindled, but presently she shrank from me. I was a man and a heretic. She, poor child, a destined nun and devoted Catholic. Thus a fourfold wall of separation divided her mind from mine. A pert smirk and a hard glance of triumph was Leonie's method of testifying her gratification. Eulalie looked sullen and envious. She had hoped to be first. Hortense and Caroline exchanged a reckless grimace on hearing their names read out somewhere near the bottom of the list. The brand of mental inferiority was considered by them as no disgrace, their hopes for the future being based solely on their personal attractions. This affair arranged, the regular lesson followed. During a brief interval employed by the pupils in ruling their books, my eye, ranging carelessly over the benches, observed for the first time that the farthest seat, in the farthest row, a seat usually vacant, was again filled by the new scholar, the Mademoiselle Henri, so ostentatiously recommended to me by the directress. Today I had on my spectacles. Her appearance, therefore, was clear to me at the first glance. I had not to puzzle over it. She looked young, yet, had I been required to name her exact age, I should have been somewhat nonplussed. The slightness of her figure might have suited 17. A certain anxious and preoccupied expression of face seemed the indication of riper years. She was dressed like all the rest, in a dark stuff gown and a white collar. Her features were dissimilar to any there, not so rounded, more defined, yet scarcely regular. The shape of her head, too, was different. The superior part more developed, the base considerably less. I felt assured at first sight that she was not a Belgian. Her complexion, her countenance, her lineaments, her figure, were all distinct from theirs, and evidently the type of another race, of a race less gifted with fullness of flesh and plenitude of blood, less jocund, material, unthinking. When I first cast my eyes on her, she sat looking fixedly down, her chin resting on her hand, and she did not change her attitude till I commenced the lesson. None of the Belgian girls would have retained one position, and that a reflective one, for the same length of time, yet, having intimated that her appearance was peculiar, as being unlike that of her Flemish companions, I have little more to say respecting it. I can pronounce no encomiums on her beauty, for she was not beautiful, nor offer condolence on her plainness, for neither was she plain. A careworn character of forehead and a corresponding moulding of the mouth struck me with a sentiment resembling surprise, but these traits would probably have passed unnoticed by any less crotchety observer. Now, reader, though I have spent more than a page in describing Mademoiselle Henri, I know well enough that I have left on your mind's eye no distinct picture of her. I have not painted her complexion, nor her eyes, nor her hair, nor even drawn the outline of her shape. You cannot tell whether her nose was aquiline or retrousse, whether her chin was long or short, her face square or oval, nor could I the first day, and it is not my intention to communicate to you at once a knowledge I myself gained by little and little. I gave a short exercise which they all wrote down. I saw the new pupil was puzzled at first with the novelty of the form and language. Once or twice she looked at me with a sort of painful solicitude, as not comprehending at all what I meant. Then she was not ready when the others were. She could not write her phrases so fast as they did. I would not help her. I went on, relentless. She looked at me. Her eye said most plainly, "I cannot follow you." I disregarded the appeal, and carelessly leaning back in my chair, glancing from time to time with a nonchalant air out of the window, I dictated a little faster. On looking towards her again, I perceived her face clouded with embarrassment, but she was still writing on most diligently. I paused a few seconds. She employed the interval in hurriedly re-perusing what she had written, and shame and discomfiture were apparent in her countenance. She evidently found that she had made great nonsense of it. In 10 minutes more, the dictation was complete, and, having allowed a brief space in which to correct it, I took their books. It was with a reluctant hand Mademoiselle Henri gave up hers. But, having once yielded it to my possession, she composed her anxious face as if, for the present, she had resolved to dismiss regret, and had made up her mind to be thought unprecedentedly stupid. Glancing over her exercise, I found that several lines had been omitted, but what was written contained very few faults. I instantly inscribed bon at the bottom of the page and returned it to her. She smiled at first incredulously, then as if reassured, but did not lift her eyes. She could look at me, it seemed, when perplexed and bewildered, but not when gratified. I thought that scarcely fair. The end of Chapter 14. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go, on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Professor, by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 15. Some time elapsed before I again gave a lesson in the first class. The holiday of Whitsuntide occupied 3 days, and on the 4th it was the turn of the 2nd Division to receive my instructions. As I made the transit of the carré, I observed, as usual, the band of sewers surrounding Mademoiselle Henri. There were only about a dozen of them, but they made as much noise as might have sufficed for 50. They seemed very little under her control. 3 or 4 at once assailed her with importunate requirements. She looked harassed. She demanded silence, but in vain. She saw me, and I read in her eye pain that a stranger should witness the insubordination of her pupils. She seemed to entreat order. Her prayers were useless. Then I remarked that she compressed her lips and contracted her brow, and her countenance, if I read it correctly, said, "I have done my best. I seem to merit blame notwithstanding. Blame me then who will." I passed on. As I closed the schoolroom door, I heard her say suddenly and sharply, addressing one of the eldest and most turbulent of the lot, "Amelie Mollenberg, ask me no question and request of me no assistance for a week to come. During that space of time I will neither speak to you nor help you." The words were uttered with emphasis, nay, with vehemence, and a comparative silence followed. Whether the calm was permanent, I know not. 2 doors now closed between me and the carré. Next day was appropriated to the first class. On my arrival I found the directress seated as usual in a chair between the 2 estrades, and before her was standing Mademoiselle Henri, in an attitude, as it seemed to me, of somewhat reluctant attention. The directress was knitting and talking at the same time. Amidst the hum of a large schoolroom, it was easy so to speak in the ear of one person as to be heard by that person alone, and it was thus Mademoiselle Routier parleyed with her teacher. The face of the latter was a little flushed, not a little troubled. There was vexation in it, whence resulting I know not, for the directress looked very placid indeed. She could not be scolding in such gentle whispers and with so equitable a mien. No, it was presently proved that her discourse had been of the most friendly tendency, for I heard the closing words. "C'est assez, mon bon ami. À présent je ne veux pas vous retenir davantage." Without reply, Mademoiselle Henri turned away. Dissatisfaction was plainly evinced in her face, and a smile, slight and brief, but bitter, distrustful, and I thought scornful, curled her lip as she took her place in the class. It was a secret, involuntary smile, which lasted but a second. An air of depression succeeded, chased away presently by one of attention and interest when I gave the word for all the pupils to take their reading books. In general, I hated the reading lesson. It was such a torture to the ear to listen to their uncouth mouthing of my native tongue, and no effort of example or precept on my part ever seemed to effect the slightest improvement in their accent. Today, each in her appropriate key, lisped, stuttered, mumbled, and jabbered as usual. About 15 had racked me in turn, and my auricular nerve was expecting with resignation the discords of the 16th, when a full, though low voice read out in clear and correct English, "On his way to Perth, the king was met by a Highland woman, calling herself a prophetess. She stood at the side of the ferry by which he was about to travel to the north, and cried with a loud voice, 'My lord the king, if you pass this water, you will never return again alive.'" From Vide, The History of Scotland. I looked up in amazement. The voice was a voice of Albion. The accent was pure and silvery. It only wanted firmness and assurance to be the counterpart of what any well-educated lady in Essex or Middlesex might have announced. Yet the speaker or reader was no other than Mademoiselle Henri, in whose grave, joyless face I saw no mark of consciousness that she had performed any extraordinary feat. No one else evinced surprise either. Mademoiselle Routier knitted away assiduously. I was aware, however, that at the conclusion of the paragraph she had lifted her eyelid and honoured me with a glance sideways. She did not know the full excellency of the teacher's style of reading, but she perceived that her accent was not that of the others, and wanted to discover what I thought. I masked my visage with indifference, and ordered the next girl to proceed. When the lesson was over, I took advantage of the confusion caused by breaking up to approach Mademoiselle Henri. She was standing near the window, and retired as I advanced. She thought I wanted to look out, and did not imagine that I could have anything to say to her. I took her exercise book out of her hand. As I turned over the leaves, I addressed her. "You have had lessons in English before?" I asked. "No, sir." "No? You read it well. You have been in England?" "Oh, no," with some animation. "You have been in English families?" Still the answer was no. Here my eye rested on the fly-leaf of the book, saw written Francis Evan Henri. "Your name?" I asked. "Yes, sir." My interrogations were cut short. I heard a little rustling behind me, and close at my back was the directress, professing to be examining the interior of a desk. "Mademoiselle," said she, looking up and addressing the teacher, "will you have the goodness to go and stand in the corridor while the young ladies are putting on their things, and try to keep some order?" Mademoiselle Henri obeyed. "What splendid weather!" observed the directress cheerfully, glancing at the same time from the window. I assented, and was withdrawing. "What of your new pupil, monsieur?" continued she, following my retreating steps. "Is she likely to make progress in English?" "Indeed, I can hardly judge. She possesses a pretty good accent. Of her real knowledge of the language I have as yet had no opportunity of forming an opinion." "And her natural capacity, monsieur?" "I have had my fears about that. Can you relieve me by an assurance at least of its average power?" "I see no reason to doubt its average power, mademoiselle, but really I scarcely know her, and have not had time to study the calibre of her capacity." "I wish you a very good afternoon." She still pursued me. "You'll observe, monsieur, and tell me what you think. I could so much better rely on your opinion than on my own. Women cannot judge of these things as men can, and excuse my pertinacity, monsieur, but it is natural I should feel interested about this poor little girl, pauvre petite. She has scarcely any relations. Her own efforts are all she has to look to. Her acquirements must be her sole fortune. Her present position has once been mine, or nearly so. It is then but natural I should sympathize with her, and sometimes, when I see the difficulty she has in managing pupils, I feel quite chagrined. I doubt not she does her best. Her intentions are excellent, but, monsieur, she wants tact and firmness. I have talked to her on the subject, but I am not fluent, and probably did not express myself with clearness. She never appears to comprehend me. Now, would you occasionally, when you see an opportunity, slip in a word of advice to her on the subject? Men have so much more influence than women have. They argue so much more logically than we do, and you, monsieur, in particular, have so paramount a power of making yourself obeyed. A word of advice from you could not but do her good, even if she were sullen and headstrong, which I hope she is not. She would scarcely refuse to listen to you. For my own part, I can truly say that I never attend one of your lessons without deriving benefit from witnessing your management of the pupils. The other masters are a constant source of anxiety to me. They cannot impress the young ladies with sentiments of respect, nor restrain the levity natural to youth. And you, monsieur, I feel the most absolute confidence. Try then to put this poor child into the way of controlling our giddy, high-spirited Brabantoises. But, monsieur, I would add one word more. Don't alarm her, amour propre. Beware of inflicting a wound there. I reluctantly admit that in that particular she is blamably, some would say ridiculously, susceptible. I fear I have touched this sore point inadvertently, and she cannot get over it." During the greater part of this harangue my hand was on the lock of the outer door. I now turned it. "Au revoir, mademoiselle," said I, and I escaped. I saw the directress's stock of words was yet far from exhausted. She looked after me. She would fain have detained me longer. Her manner towards me had been altered ever since I had begun to treat her with hardness and indifference. She almost cringed to me on every occasion. She consulted my countenance incessantly, and beset me with innumerable little officious attentions. Servility creates despotism. This slavage homage, instead of softening my heart, only pampered whatever was stern and exacting in its mood. The very circumstance of her hovering round me like a fascinated bird seemed to transform me into a rigid pillar of stone. Her flatteries irritated my scorn, her blandishments confirmed my reserve. At times I wondered what she meant by giving herself such trouble to win me. When the more profitable Pelée was already in her nets, and when, too, she was aware that I possessed her secret, for I had not scrupled to tell her as much. But the fact is that, as it was her nature to doubt the reality and undervalue the worth of modesty, affection, disinterestedness, to regard these qualities as foibles of character, so it was equally her tendency to consider pride, hardness, selfishness as proofs of strength. She would trample on the neck of humility. She would kneel at the feet of disdain. She would meet tenderness with secret contempt. Indifference she would woo with ceaseless assiduities. Benevolence, devotedness, enthusiasm were her antipathies. For dissimulation and self-interest she had a preference. They were real wisdom in her eyes. Moral and physical degradation, mental and bodily inferiority, she regarded with indulgence. They were foils capable of being turned to good account as set-offs for her own endowments. To violence, injustice, tyranny, she succumbed. They were her natural masters. She had no propensity to hate, no impulse to resist them. The indignation their behests awake in some hearts was unknown in hers. From all this it resulted that the false and selfish called her wise, the vulgar and debased termed her charitable, the insolent and unjust dubbed her amiable, the conscientious and benevolent generally at first accepted as valid her claim to be considered one of themselves. But ere long the plating of pretension wore off. The real material appeared below, and they laid her aside as a deception. The end of Chapter 15. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.